Hello everyone and welcome. Happy cold Friday. I hope it's not as cold where you are as where I am in Maryland because it's cold. Glad you're here and hope you're warm where you are in your office or home. And thanks for joining us today. Today we've got Vic Strecher, who's been on my to-do list for some time, so I'm thrilled that I've been able to pin him down. And I'll have Kelly introduce him here in just a second, but let me remind you that this is being recorded and will be available most likely later this afternoon. If you may see the discount code in the chat box. If you choose to, you can use this to use that code for 25% off the optional purchase of continuing education. Totally your call. And in the chat box, as questions or thoughts, whatever occur to you, please do type them in, and we'll get through as many of them as we can. And I think before I turn it over to Kelly to introduce Vic, I want to give you guys a tiny little heads up. If you're on Goodreads, please go look for Health Promotion Live Book Club. We haven't promoted it at all yet, so you guys are totally in the know. Really impressive. So do join us, and we're going to start reading some books together and getting together with the authors and having some good discussion. So there you have it. Goodreads.com. Almost sounded like a commercial. Kelly, would you like to introduce Vic?
Yes, I would.
All right.
Right, today we have Vic Strecher. Vic has been a professor in the University of Michigan School of Public Health since 1995. He founded the Center for Health Communication Research and has been a leading investigator on over $45 million in grant-funded studies. With the university, Dr. Strecher founded Health Media, Inc. in 1998, an Ann Arbor-based company that develops and disseminates award-winning tailored health interventions to millions of users. In 2008, Health Media was purchased by Johnson & Johnson. Currently, as Director for Innovation and Social Entrepreneurship, Dr. Strecher is helping the University of Michigan disseminate research to the real world, improving the public's health nationally and globally, and we are really excited to finally have him here today. So, Vic?
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to everybody for tuning into this. So my talk today is going to be about purpose in life, a new direction for health-related behavior change. I've called this On Purpose. And just really to reiterate my background in 2 seconds, I have founded the Center for Health Communications Research at the University of Michigan, where we've designed over 50 interactive media programs, and we conduct research on all of this. We built a tailoring system called the Michigan Tailoring System, which is now being used not only in the health area but also in the education area to tailor educational interventions for students. We have built programs in every conceivable type of communication that I can think of anyway, from mobile technology to information kiosks to tailored print materials, internet, CD-ROM disks, etc. But one of the themes that we have used throughout is the concept of what we call tailoring, or tailoring information based on the data that we've collected from you as an individual. So we're not talking about tailoring to groups. We're talking about collecting information at an individual level and tailoring to their very specific needs. And what we found over the last 20 years of research is that as we create tailored messages that are increasingly relevant to that user, that we actually find more elaboration cognitively of that message. We find that it becomes encoded in memory more readily, and it's actually less cognitive work to process tailored materials. We've been showing this and publishing this in journals such as Nature Neuroscience, where we send tailored materials into scanners, into fMRI scanners while we're scanning the person's brain. What we also find is a pattern of neural activity that then in turn relates to behavior change. So we're now finding a very direct link between our tailored messages, cognitive neural activation of specific parts of the brain, and that leads to behavior change. So given all of that, I realized that much of my work was being seen by about 6 people who were writing journal articles, and they would use my article to reference in their journal articles, and I realized I wasn't making a big impact in the real world. So little over 15 years ago, I created a company called Health Media, which is located in Ann Arbor, and that company, as I said before, was sold to Johnson & Johnson 4 years ago. So around that time, around 4 years ago, I was up in northern Michigan, and this is a true story. I was kayaking out into beautiful and very smooth, but uncommonly smooth, Lake Michigan water, and I saw the sun rise around 5:30 in the morning, and I literally had an epiphany. I had this connection suddenly on the water, and I know this sounds kind of unscientific, but part of this talk may be considered a bit unscientific, but I had this epiphany on the water that I really needed to change the things that I was doing. I needed to change the direction that I was taking in my own career, particularly in the models, the behavioral models that I was using. Not that I was throwing them all away, it's just that one of the big problems I saw was that only about 30% of people were changing in our programming or anybody else's programming for that matter. And we seem to all be hitting a wall using kind of the standard cognitive behavioral messages. And even when we tailored messages, we could increase behavior change, but it all seemed to be hitting around 30%. The other thing is that there is such a focus on tiny little changes to be made. And I really thought that a lot of people, and I observed a lot of people, making big, what might be called quantum changes. And Bill Miller wrote a book called Quantum Change. Bill Miller is one of the creators of motivational interviewing, and is a beautiful book about how very often, suddenly, very rapidly, and often through some chaotic event, people suddenly make significant changes in their lives. So I started wondering more about that with an effort to try to change the direction that we have typically in health behavior change. So after a lot of reading, about 6 months of reading, including reading ancient philosophy as well as the most modern science, I started thinking about this metaphor of the boiling frog. And most of you probably know this metaphor, but the idea is if you toss a frog, a live frog, in boiling water, it will jump out of the water right away if it can. If you put a frog in cool water and then gradually increase the heat over time, the frog will get sleepy and the frog will boil to death. I thought that's such a great metaphor, frankly, such a metaphor for our lives. It's frankly a metaphor for our sedentary behavior, for our eating behavior, for our so many different kinds of behavior, including climate change. All of these things are very gradually increasing problems that we have, and we don't notice them. We're kind of all boiling frogs. We're frogs in that water that's just gradually heating up, and we don't notice it. And this is my field. This is what we do. It's related. All of these boiling frog problems are related to these personal decisions that we're making in our lives. So when you think about personal decisions accounting for roughly 50% of disease and death, and this is pretty much how we look at this in public health. This is a little chart from the same article. We look at things such as diet. We say, well, diet is related to being overweight, and being overweight is related to all of these things, all of these medical causes of death and disease. So what we typically do is say, well, we start with the idea of death, and we say if you don't change these behaviors, you get sick and you die. Even our health risk assessments that we create and have created for the last 30 years, typically those health risk assessments ask questions related to our diet or our smoking or our physical activity, and as you well know, many other things. And then the type of feedback that you get is quit smoking or you'll die, eat better or you'll die, start moving or you'll die. This is not a health risk assessment, it's more of a death risk assessment. The idea to me of just trying to scare a person or give a person what their risk of dying is, to me personally is not that motivating. Professional marketers for decades now have tried to appeal to your core values as opposed to trying to scare you. So, you know, if I'm a tobacco industry executive, I'd be attracted to the message, this cigarette makes me independent like a cowboy. So people, you know, even if they're on Madison Avenue, they may feel more like a cowboy if they're smoking, or this beer gives me friends. What we're doing here is appealing to a person's core values as opposed to just saying, if you don't quit smoking, you'll get sick and die. I mean, you're all familiar with the new Surgeon General's report from, you know, this is the 50th year since the first Surgeon General's report of Julius Richmond. And, you know, basically the point of it is, boy, there's a lot more things that kill you from cigarettes that you didn't even know yet. To me, that's kind of a lame message, to be perfectly honest. You know, if they expect people to suddenly say, oh, wow, I didn't realize that it kills you in this way and this way now, so I'll quit smoking, that just doesn't strike me as being a very powerful message, at least to me. And I think there's a fair amount of data to show that. And yet, what we do in our field is typically try to scare people. So this particular scene was on a billboard as I was driving to the airport a few months ago, and I started wondering how many people drive off the road just looking at this billboard. How many deaths occur as a result of that. I certainly don't think people quit smoking as a result of this. And some of you may disagree, and I'd love to discuss that, you know, if we want a discussion about fear messages and behavior change. But the idea here that, you know, we are not really appealing to people's core values as much as we are trying to warn them about the risks of disease and the risk of death, I think there are big holes in that argument, quite honestly. If we were this boiling frog, or if we're looking in to look at this boiling frog and we said, hey, frog, get out of this water, it's boiling. If you don't jump out of this water, you are going to die. What would the frog typically say? Well, we've got a lot of data on this. We know that when we give messages related to risk and fear and death, this is the type of message that the frog might utter. What do you know? Are you an expert on boiling water? This water isn't so hot. Now go away. I'm getting kind of sleepy. In other words, they'd question the source of the message. Are you an expert on boiling water? They'd also deny the message. Oh, this isn't so hot. And very often, you know, I know other people who have smoked a lot and they've lived a long time. In fact, I know a lot of people who eat a lot and they're totally healthy and totally fine. So go away, I'm getting kind of sleepy. It'd be a very standard response. And one of the things I started wondering about in this journey that I've been on is why? Why do people reject these kinds of health messages, especially the health messages that try to induce fear or risk-based messages? What's going on there? And I realized that the answer is, in a way, in a general way, very, very simple. It's that we're defensive. I almost view defensiveness as kind of a castle wall that we put around our head, around our brain. And let's call this castle wall the ego. The ego is something that protects us from all sorts of external messages, but the ego also protects, you know, that may be really harmful to us, but the ego also protects us from messages that may do us good. We're now increasingly allowed to live inside our castle walls or our ego more and more now as we can open up the internet and my Google page agrees with every single thing that I believe in. It's starting to advertise or give me advice or recommendations for things, recommendations for news sources. All of these things agree with me. And I can stay and pretty much live within my castle wall 24/7 if I want. In the past, we didn't have that kind of media. Media would often challenge us, and now we can live in a place that does not challenge us so much. So I think actually we're becoming increasingly defensive, and I'd say we're all defensive. I'm certainly defensive. I think everybody has these defenses. So the question is, that I started pondering 3 years ago, was how do you somehow see around, get rid of this castle wall? What is going on with this castle wall, this ego? Is there a way to break through it with the kind of messages that we want to deliver to people? And I saw a couple of ways of doing this. One way would be when we become broken open. Ram Dass, this is a picture of Ram Dass, who was a psychologist at Harvard, then became a Buddhist monk and spiritual leader, suffered a severe stroke in his early 60s. And when he had that stroke, this is what he said: ego breaks open, then you see who you really are. I thought that was a fascinating comment from Ram Dass. In other words, rather than loathing the fact that he had a stroke and trying to figure out how he would cope with that, instead he viewed it as an opportunity. He said, well, now my ego's broken open. I've gotten sick. I'm now, I now see myself more clearly. I think that's pretty amazing for a person to have done. And by the way, I worked in a cancer center here at in our cancer center at the University of Michigan for 15 years. And I met hundreds of people who had had cancer. And so often I found that once they had cancer, they broke open as well. Something in them broke open, their ego broke, and they started seeing things in a different way. And they would become maybe a vegetarian, or maybe they'd start working out more, they'd take up yoga, or they'd start praying, they'd start meditating. Whatever it was, they would change their life in some significant way. And I'll bet that most of you, whether you've had these kind of broken open experiences yourself or have observed people going through some traumatic experience, have witnessed this breaking open process. Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, knew he had pancreatic cancer and was going to die of this pancreatic cancer in 2005 when he gave Stanford's commencement address to students. And he said, death is very likely the single best invention of life. It's life's change agent. That's a strange thing to say. And yet what he was really saying, like the Stoic philosophers would, is that when you think more about your death, in fact, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross said the same thing, when you contemplate your death, you actually start thinking more about your life. You start thinking about the scarcity of your life. And there are actually studies in this area where they've given students the opportunity to contemplate their own death. And as a result of contemplation of their own death, they start viewing life as a more scarce resource, which we all should, since our chances of dying are all 100%. And as a result, we start valuing life. So rather than either denying death or avoiding thoughts about death, and we do, by the way, all the time, would we rather see a movie about, like Star Wars, or would we rather see a movie about somebody dying? Typically, we would have, we'd view the happy movie as something that we'd rather go to see. But when we start contemplating death or the meaning of death, we start actually valuing our own lives more. And it's a pretty simple equation, actually. It relates to economics. If we had $10,000, it'd be very easy to give a couple dollars away to somebody on the street asking for money. If we had $5, it would be more difficult. So what we're reminded of in economic theory is that a dollar is not a dollar is not a dollar. The same with the years of our life. If our lives, the years of our lives are really related to the amount of life that we have left, then it may make more sense to contemplate our own mortality. And while that sounds morbid, I would suggest that that's something we always avoid. In fact, we usually use death in order to somehow scare a person, rather than maybe encouraging a consideration of mortality in order to make our lives more valuable. Marcus Aurelius, who is probably the best ancient Roman emperor, but also a famous Stoic philosopher, said, do not act as if you are going to live 10,000 years. Death hangs over you while you live, while it's in your power. Be good. So he's talking about a couple of things here. He's talking about, first of all, the contemplation of death. And by the way, in Marcus Aurelius's very short but beautiful book called Meditations, which I'd highly recommend reading, he would talk about waking up every morning and assuming that he would die. And in the assumption that he would die, in the contemplation of his death that day, he lived a bigger life. And that was part of a standard Stoic philosophy approach to living. So Stoicism isn't like I'm Spock and I'm always emotionless. Actually, Stoic philosophers had tremendous emotion, and by thinking about their mortality, they ended up thinking much more about living a big life. So, of course, we don't want to be living or thinking about morbid thoughts like death all the time. We also obviously don't want to be sick. Although I will point this out. So many of us end up getting sick or having some traumatic event happen to us, whether it's the loss of a loved one, could be the loss of a job, it could be a divorce, it could be, many, many traumatic events. These traumatic events happen to all of us, and they happen in chaotic ways. We can't predict them. But one thing we might be able to do in the health education, health promotion area is take advantage of those times when a person may go through a traumatic event and use that as a point of being broken open, where the person can see more clearly, where their castle wall, their ego has actually been broken, and they may be very open to significant behavior changes in their lives. Often we let a person go during that time, but we really could take advantage of different life experiences that a person has. Now, is there any other way to get rid of this castle wall or somehow get through this castle wall if we have an important message? Well, there is a fairly new theory that's been studied now pretty carefully called SelfAffirmation Theory. The idea here is if a person starts thinking about core values that they have, the core values that they have in their life. Let's say this woman says, my core values are being a good mother, I want to be a good spouse, I want to be in control of my life, but I'd also like to be kind of cool, I'd like to be attractive as well. Those are that woman's core values. It turns out if she starts writing those values down or reciting them verbally and starting to elaborate, if she starts elaborating on those core values, she actually starts, we start seeing her ego actually break down. What happens is that her defensiveness to our health messages actually start reducing. Her defensiveness starts reducing, and she's more open to behavior change. So there are at least 6 or 7 articles now, studies, randomized trials, that have looked at one group self-affirming core values and another group just writing down things like the current events of the day or the week, and then they will show people, give people a health message, and the people who have just written down their core values are far more likely to attend to that message, accept the message, and then there are a number of studies that have shown actual behavior changes as a result of this self-affirmation. This is kind of new to me. It was quite different from any other theory that I've heard about, and it seemed to relate to something that was very positive as opposed to something very negative. Rather than scaring a person with these labels or with some message, you could have a person self-affirming who they were, and as a result of self-affirming who they were, they would accept messages more. So then I started asking the question, well, why? Why does writing down your important values reduce defensiveness? And it turns out that very soon after I asked that question, a woman named Jennifer Crocker wrote this article, Why Does Writing About Important Values Reduce Defensiveness? She's a University of Michigan psychologist who's just moved to Ohio State University to be a professor there. But here's what she found. She ran 2 studies that basically confirmed other people's studies about writing down important values and then what that does in terms of reducing defensiveness. But she also had people talk about what was going on in their mind when they were writing down these core values. And here's what she found. People started writing things related to community, related to loving, related to connected feelings with other people. But very, very positive emotions. And what she said in this article is these studies, in concert with previous research, suggest that values affirmation reduces defensiveness via self-transcendence. Now, when I first read this, I thought, oh my goodness, this has gone off the deep end now. What is self-transcendence? And I started studying self-transcendence more. What does that really mean? The idea of self-transcendence is that you're rising above your own ego. You're actually lifting above your ego. You're thinking about things that are bigger than yourself. And a nagging thought that I've had for the last decade is that so many people who have very poor health behaviors, not all of them, but many of them tend to have this strong focus on themselves. And that's not to say they're selfish. It's just I've seen a fairly strong tendency of narcissism among many people who have very, very poor health behaviors. And I don't see the idea, I don't see these people necessarily saying, I want to do something much bigger than myself. So the concept of considering your core values and thinking about core values that are self-transcending may actually help a person rise above this ego wall and change their behavior. So then there was a follow-up study very recently published looking at a couple of different types of values affirmation. We might think about different types of values affirmation and one, here I'll go back to this, different types of values affirmation, including self-enhancing values. So when we talk about core values, some people may have core values such as power or fame or wealth or attractiveness, but other people may have self-transcending values such as community, love, support, generosity, personal growth, things like that. So this study started with 92 college students. From these college students, what they did was socially exclude them. And I'm not going to get into detail about this. This is a standard manipulation in social psychology where they basically tell some of the students, well, you were actually not selected by your fellow students to join them in this team. Or in another group, they said, well, you were actually invited by these other students to join their team, but it turns out that we don't need you, so you're just going to work independently. And all of this was a sham. But the idea would be if you were hoping to be on the soccer team or the basketball team and people said, no, we don't actually want to run with you, sorry, that would be social exclusion, and that is ego threatening. And for now over a decade, we've known that when your ego is threatened through social exclusion, you're more likely to eat, you're more likely to drink alcohol, you're more likely to smoke more cigarettes. Your ego, when it's threatened, you tend to engage in poor health behaviors. So we've known that for a long time. We know that socially excluding people leads to poor health behaviors. And so they divided people into a socially excluded group, and that would be called the ego threat group, you weren't picked, or the no ego threat group, where they said you were picked, but you were randomly chosen to work alone. I hope everybody gets this so far. Then they divided each of these two groups, the green group and the pink group, into 3 groups, where they had in both of these groups either write down their daily routines. In other words, there was no values affirmation. All they did was just write down the daily routine. Or they wrote about self-enhancing values. They were asked to write down their own personal self-enhancing values related to power or wealth or independence. And I'm sure that all of us could, if asked, we could write down self-enhancing values that we think are important. Or they were asked to write down self-transcending values, empathy, support, things larger than yourself, growth, personal relationships, community, etc. So you see that in both of these groups, the green group and the pink group, they were doing the same thing. In the pink group, they didn't expect any difference between self-affirmation of transcending values or enhancing values or just writing daily routine because their ego wasn't threatened. There was no need to change, and this self-affirmation intervention wouldn't have any impact on them. It would only be in the green groups that they hypothesized there would be a difference. And they felt that writing down self-transcending values would lead to better performance than writing self-enhancing values, which in turn would lead to better performance than just writing down your daily routine. And just to let you know, in self-affirmation theory in the past, before this study, people lumped transcending values and enhancing values together. So this is a very smart thing, because you have to think after a while, well, are there some values that are maybe, quote, better than other values? So here's the real manipulation then in this experiment. They said, oh, by the way, we have this bowl of chocolate chip cookies, and we need them taste tested. What do you think? Do you mind taste testing these? Have as many as you like. And that was the key. Have as many as you like. So the real question in this whole study was, how many chocolate chip cookies did these different groups eat on average? So what do you think? Here's what they found. As expected, let's start on the right side. As expected, there were no differences in the no ego threat group. Their ego wasn't threatened, so it didn't really matter whether they're writing down their values or not writing down their values. But the first simple test is, when your ego is threatened, if you're in the control groups, do you eat more cookies if your ego is threatened than if your ego is not threatened? In other words, this comparison. And sure enough, they found that people ate twice as many cookies if their ego is threatened. That is nothing new. As I said, for over a decade we've known that. However, the big important tests were on the left side among the green groups. So the general self-affirmation test would be lumping transcendent and enhancing values and comparing them against a control group that just wrote down the daily routine. In other words, this comparison. And this comparison was also statistically significant. So people ate far fewer cookies if they just wrote about their core values. What's important and interesting, though, is that if you wrote transcending values, you ate far fewer cookies, almost half as many cookies, as if you were writing down self-enhancing values. Now, this has been studied recently by two people who developed self-determination theory, Dichi and Ryan. They took a look at college students and asked them about whether they tended to have, they found out whether these college graduates tended to have self-transcending values or self-enhancing values. Some of the college students wanted to go to Wall Street and make a lot of money. They wanted to be attractive, beautiful, get the best seats at, in restaurants, have the best, experiences in everything. And then there were self-transcending students, people who wanted to do good things in the world, to change the world, to improve their communities. And they found 2 years later that both of the groups achieved what they wanted. In other words, the self-transcending group achieved greater self-transcending values. The self-enhancing group achieved more self-enhancing values, such as money and fame. However, the self-enhancing college students 2 years later had greater ill-being, both physically and mentally. The self-transcending students had greater well-being, both physically and mentally. There are other studies we could talk about a little bit later if you want. There's some very recent studies looking at these very issues and even physiological responses to stressors. So this is very, very new stuff. And it seems to relate, these values, especially self-transcending values, seem to relate to an overall bigger purpose that people have in their lives. And so I started on my own journey studying that concept of purpose and finding that people who had a strong purpose in their life were 2.4 times less likely to develop Alzheimer's disease 7 years later than if they had a low or no purpose in their life. That was pretty amazing. If we had a drug that did that, that would be in our water supply. Certainly be a lot of further tests to be done in that area. Purpose in life is related to reduced risk of myocardial infarction or heart attacks. Purpose in life is related to reduced risk of type 2 diabetes. It's related to reduced incidence of stroke. It's related to a longer life overall. And in almost all of these studies, they call for interventions in the area of trying to help people find purpose in life. So there's one study that came out that is a randomized trial, that looked at the concept of an intervention, but it was an intervention of intensive meditation. And the outcome was repair of our telomeres. Telomeres are the ends of our chromosomes. The ends of our chromosomes, like the aglets of our shoelaces, you know, those plastic caps on the ends of our shoelaces, telomeres keep our chromosomes from fraying. And when we see a reduction or shortening in our telomeres, then our chromosomes start fraying, we get sick, and we die. Elizabeth Blackburn won the 2009 Nobel Prize in Medicine for discovering this process. And Elizabeth Blackburn was part of this larger team that studied the impact of intensive meditation for 3 months on telomere activation. And sure enough, they found that the meditators, compared to a waitlist control group, were more likely to have telomere repair. But that wasn't the whole story. The whole story was that the meditators developed greater purpose in their lives, transcending purpose. And that transcending purpose that resulted from meditation, this is an intervention now, the transcending purpose that resulted from the meditation resulted in the greater telomere activation. It was not the meditation, it was the purpose in life that was developed from the meditation as an intervention to boost purpose in life. After reading all of this, both the philosophical parts from ancient philosophy that we've talked about to fairly modern philosophy to very modern science, I decided to write a book about this. And the book is called On Purpose. And this is a book I can talk about a little bit later, but the idea in this book is that it is a journey. It is a personal journey that I went through myself, as well as a journey of discovering the importance of purpose and this new direction that we could take. I decided to write the book, as you might guess so far in this talk, as a graphic novel. I know that's a little bit different than other books. I was going to write it as a self-help book until I realized after the first 2 chapters that I hate self-help books. So I decided to write this more as a personal journey. And in a personal journey, typically some of the best personal journeys include a sage in that personal journey. So for example, in Star Wars, we have Yoda as the sage. In Pinocchio, we have Jiminy Cricket as the sage. I decided I needed to search for a sage. So I was in the British Museum, and I was looking around. British Museum has the largest collection of ancient Egyptian artifacts of any other place in the world, mainly because they stole most of them from Egypt. So they have a huge Egyptian artifact gallery in the British Museum in London. So I started looking around, and I found this cartouche, as well as other cartouches. I found this cartouche of this scarab and this ball, which represents the sun. And it looked like the scarab was kind of pushing the sun. And I was intrigued by that and started looking at other parts of, at other hieroglyphs. And I noticed that I just started thinking about, for some reason, this Sisyphean task of pushing a boulder up a mountain every day. And I also noticed that he was pushing this ball, this sun, above what looked like a castle wall. I thought, well, that's very cool. And I noticed everywhere that this scarab was pushing this sun around everywhere. And it turns out that this scarab is Khepri, who is the scarab god, and he's the most famous god in ancient Egypt. And the scarab god, Khepri, is in charge of rebirth, transformation, and transcendence. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. He's actually in charge of pushing the sun up out of darkness every morning, and they call darkness chaos, by the way. So when chaos happens, he pushes the sun up every morning and that represents rebirth and transformation, and some of the things that I had experienced myself. So I started doing more research on this scarab god, and I found out that the model for the scarab god, very oddly, is this, the dung beetle. The dung beetle rolls his ball in a perfect sphere. He emits a pheromone, and then all these female dung beetles come in and go, well, nice ball. That looks great. I think I'll end up rolling with you. And so the female and male push this ball in a near perfect straight line. Interestingly enough, through past dung beetle robbers who want to steal the ball, or crevices, places where the ball could fall, any sort of obstacle, they just keep pushing it as if they had this super strong purpose in their lives. In fact, just last year, late last year, it was discovered that dung beetles actually navigate the rolling of their ball according to the Milky Way. There is no other insect that has been known to navigate according to the stars, and dung beetles do. This is a pretty impressive creature, pretty impressive insect, and I could see why the ancient Egyptians were so impressed with it. So anyway, these dung beetles dig a hole after a while. They make mad, passionate dung beetle love, and they bury the eggs in the dung ball. And this fulfills their purpose. So I thought, I think I may have my sage, and that sage, his name is Winston. So Winston the dung beetle became my sage of on purpose, my journey that I went through. And the idea is that in this journey is that Winston the dung beetle helps us transcend. He becomes the sage in the story and actually the smarter person in the story as we start navigating. Now, what do we mean by purpose in life? What is that concept? Well, it's measured in the research studies that I've been talking about by usually 6 questions, and they look like this. I won't show you all 6, but I have a sense of direction and purpose in my life. Well, okay, that's an easy one. Now, there's some people wander aimlessly through life. I am not one of them. So that would be another element of having a purpose in life. Here's some people's purposes. These are seniors who we asked to give us their purpose in life. To support my son and my grandsons so they live full lives. My grandsons are autistic. Now imagine seniors who have retired and very often they've lost their purpose. So one of the things we're very interested in is helping seniors repurpose their lives. Help others understand and learn how things work. This is a senior who was an engineering professor. Here's another one, to enjoy researching and creating garments for historic dance and sharing this with others. This is my favorite. Be ready for someone when they need me, because I've had so much help and love from other people when I needed them. So if we think about that, that's a way to live your life overall, if we represent that as a tree. But how you live your life has to be supported and nourished by this purpose in your life, and also supported by this root system that we might call your values. So if a person is spiritual, then that person's purpose may be related to God and to serve God. Other people may, even atheists, such as Simone de Beauvoir, Jean-Paul Sartre, and many other existential philosophers, were atheists. They still said and argued that you have to have a purpose or meaning in your life, but you have to develop it yourself. So whether you believe that God gives you meaning or purpose, or whether you need to create it yourself, that's beyond my thinking. So I'm not trying to address that issue. What I am addressing is that everybody needs a purpose in their life. And everybody, in a way, needs to align their life, how they're living, or their tree, with their root system and this nourishment that comes from their core purpose. So how would we do that? How would we do that if we're in an employer setting, or if we're in a large health plan, or if we're in a big community, or if we're in a big government, whatever it is? How do we get people to transcend their egos a little bit more and open themselves up for change? The idea would be hopefully to give people purposes. So one purpose, as we've gone through and started surveying people's purposes in life, one is to be a role model for working mothers. Another would be, and this is an actual custodian in an elementary school. He has a purpose that then relates to his life. His life is giving the children in his school a clean building and serving God. Another one, a cancer survivor. I paint pictures that express the emotions of my breast cancer experience. Families can have purposes as well. We help each member of our family have a pure life of hard work, great happiness, and generosity. So, to summarize and start wrapping up a little bit, how do we get this frog to jump out of the boiling water? Well, rather than focusing, on the right side, which is focusing on disease and death, and if you don't change, you're going to get sick, and if you don't change, you'll die. what if we changed the direction a little bit in this and we said, let's anchor your behavior change motivation with life. And by the way, if you don't have a purpose in life, you're rudderless. It doesn't matter how much wind is in your sails. You aren't going to hit that harbor because you don't know where the harbor is. And by the way, that's a quote from Seneca, a 2,000-year-old Stoic philosopher. So how do we help this frog jump out, obtain more energy in his or her life toward a purpose, toward having a greater alignment between how they live their life and their purpose in life? So rather than focusing on this direction where all the arrows are pointing toward disease and pointing toward death, how about if we reverse those arrows completely, where we started asking about purpose and anchoring in purpose, and then focusing on health behaviors that might give you more energy or vitality in your life. I've done a fair amount of research now over the last couple of years looking at the epidemiology of vitality and energy. And it turns out there are 5 areas that are very important to give you more vitality and energy. And they include sleep, presence or mindfulness, activity, meaning physical activity, creativity, and eating well, or space, a simple moniker. So if you give yourself space, you can develop greater energy to achieve a purpose. Again, if you don't have a purpose in your life, you're kind of floating rudderless, and there won't be any direction to this energy, and it'll be hard to maintain these behaviors. It'll be very hard to maintain motivation, long-term motivation for quantum change. So thinking about this and thinking about these space criteria, how do we help people make these changes in their lives and monitor sleep, presence, activity, creativity, and eating well? Well, in addition to the book that I created, I also created a website. And this is dungbeetle.org. It's a not-for-profit movement that we've created. So it's Dung Beetle, DUNGBEETLE.org. And on dungbeetle.org, you can learn more about the book that I wrote and my own personal story and journey. But you can also pick up an app for free. And if you get this app, the first thing that it does is ask you about your core values. It starts with 15 top values, and you get to pick the top 3 to 5 of these values. Once you've picked those, it opens up the screen to this root system where you're able to actually take your cursor or your finger, depending on the kind of computer you have, and move the roots further down, which represents a greater, more deeply held or more important value that you have. Then you're asked to write your purpose. This is my own personal purpose, just to divulge that. To reduce nihilism or lack of meaning in the world. In other words, giving more people a purpose. To teach my students, I'm a professor here, to teach my students as if each student were my own daughter. Oh, and I'd like to be cool too. I know I'm not, but it's my purpose. I know it's self-enhancing, it's not self-transcending, but that's my purpose and I'm sticking with it. So also, though, you can go and visit, and this is completely voluntary, but if you want, you can go visit the Grim Reaper, and you can put down what you would like on your headstone. And the idea, as I said early in this talk, is that understanding more about death, or contemplating death a little bit more, as Elizabeth Kubler-Ross said, will give you greater value of your life in the years of your life. It creates this urgency to live your life more fully. And just to editorialize for a second, I just think that our world now is so focused on what the Kardashian sisters are doing last week, or whether there's a new Miley Cyrus twerking video or something on YouTube. To me, this has just gotten sickening. Our society needs more transcending purpose. And actually in our field, what all of you are doing in this field has a connection with this concept of greater purpose in life. It's just I think we've ignored it, kind of obeying more of a medical model that focuses on disease and death. So also you can chart your day every single day where, the steps of finding your purpose and your core values is just an initial step, but every single day I can adjust how close my life was as I lived it yesterday to my purpose in my life. I'd say really good alignment between purpose and how you lived your life is a real definition of health. Also, every day you can monitor how well you slept, how present or active you were, how present or mindful you were, how physically active, how creative you were, and how well you ate. And then, as a result of that, you can start monitoring how well you do. And over time, after doing this 10 times for 10 days, it can tell you which of the space criteria are best correlated with your alignment. Again, what I consider true health. So this is a new type of health risk appraisal. I don't think it's a death risk appraisal. I think it is a true health risk appraisal. And now we have offered this on iTunes as well as through the website for free. So all we're doing, we want hopefully hundreds of thousands or hopefully millions of people starting to use this app so that they can personally understand how how to monitor space and how these space criteria relate to their alignment and their purpose in their life. So this is an intervention designed to help people develop a stronger purpose in life and monitor and maintain and actually further develop vitality to aligning their lives and their purpose in life. Now, somebody fairly recently sent me this cartoon of a grown-up saying, you need to find a purpose in your life, and the kid says, well, I've tried, but it's not coming up on my iPhone. Well, it does now. So there's this iPhone app that you can get through iTunes, and it also works beautifully on your iPad as well. So to close up, this is a journey that I've been on personally over the last 4 years. I've tried to redirect my thinking from a traditional way of considering motivation and behavior change toward a very new direction. It includes a lot of elements that are not typical in our field, such as values affirmation, self-transcendence, purpose in life, more energy in your life, and life purpose alignment. I'm going to stop there. And I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found a couple of new ideas from what I was saying. And if you are interested in the book, you can go either to Amazon, and you can easily purchase the book there, or if you do go to dungbeetle.org and you go to buy the book, there's a tab that says buy the book, and there's a promotional code. If you put in the word SCARAB, S-C-A-R-A-B, you can get a 20% discount on the book. So that's my little self-promotion advertisement at the end of this. But if you are interested in what I've been saying, this book covers this area in much greater depth. Thank you very much for your time. I'm open to any questions you might have.
Super, Vic. Nice job. Beautiful book. I can't wait to get my hands on it. And maybe we should just make this our first book club book and get you for another upcoming date and talk about it together. So please do type your questions or comments, whatever, into the chat box, and I'll make sure that Vic gets them. You know, I have to say though, in the however many 4 or 5 years that I've been doing this, I've never in a webinar heard passionate dung beetle love. So
come on.
It just doesn't come up that often in conversation.
You've got to look at some of these videos too. It's amazing.
Yeah, I've heard, I don't know, PBS or something about
right.
The amazing things about dung beetles. Who would have thunk it?
We now have student groups here who are part of this movement and really working on this movement, and they call themselves the Dung Beetles.
With pride.
Yes.
Okay, let's see here. Pedro says, instead of reducing nihilism, why not embrace purpose of life or purpose in life?
Yes. Well, I think the two are two sides of the same coin. You're absolutely right. My concept, and in fact, Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, and he developed logotherapy or meaning therapy, he was once asked what his purpose in life was, and he said, to give other people a purpose in life. And that is my purpose as well, to give other people a purpose in life, but with the outcome of reducing nihilism or lack of meaning in life.
You know, I wonder, because of the graphic nature of this book, which I think is brilliant, I wonder if it won't be, I suppose, more accessible to the population at large. Give them an opportunity to think about these things, because it's not...
Well, that was my intention.
Yeah.
you know, Viktor Frankl wrote this book called Man's Search for Meaning about his experiences of going through 3 concentration camps. And it was his own personal journey that he went through, but then he also integrated his logotherapy in the book. And I have not talked about the whole book, which includes a personal journey that I just didn't discuss today, related to the death of one of my daughters. But in this book, I thought, what would Viktor Frankl do now if Viktor Frankl understood interactive multimedia and tailoring and could build cell phone apps and could have a Huffington Post blog? I think he would communicate this differently, and he wouldn't suggest psychoanalysis with a psychotherapist for 20 years to do logotherapy. He'd probably build a new app. And so, and his book might not be all in print, but it might include a graphic novel. Daniel Pink recently wrote a graphic novel. There are graphic novels now about Richard Feynman, the physicist. There's some amazing new ways of communicating and expressing a story, and I thought this would be an interesting one to try.
Yeah, there's a lot of abbreviations in it, but I think he's saying, I found in my dissertation that grandmothers who started to adhere to antihypertensive treatments were the ones who were in charge of their grandchildren due to the death of their children of AIDS.
That's interesting.
Okay. So it's hard to, I haven't quite deciphered that, but I would, you might say, for example, a person who needed to take care of somebody would be much more likely to adhere to medication. That would be absolutely the case. I'll give you an example, another example. My father, when he was 70, started developing diabetes, and his doctor said, if you don't change your life, change what you eat, start working out more, you'll lose your legs and then you will die. That's very standard. And my dad turned to him and said, I don't care if I die. And the doctor was horrified. Well, of course you must care if you die. No, I don't. No one cares about me anymore. And then the doctor was smart enough to say, wouldn't you like to see your granddaughters graduate from high school? Wouldn't you like to be there to support your grandchildren, be a mentor for them? And my father started crying, and he never cries, but he started crying, and now he's 82 years old. He's not even close to being a diabetic. He's got much healthier behaviors, and he's got a strong purpose in his life.
That's awesome. Tom says, I have to read the graphic novel. I have read the graphic novel and enjoyed it. I'm a wellness director at Presbyterian Villages in Michigan, and this year I have been charged with creating an engagement strategy for the 3,000 seniors living in our 28 communities. I would welcome the opportunity to meet with Dr. Strecher and talk with him about helping seniors repurpose their lives, because they're most likely going to be how they help themselves better engage with life.
Well, I would be very happy to speak with them, and you can just reach me very easily on the email that I have on the site, strecher@umich.edu. That's STRECHER @umich.edu.
Super. Okay, well, how much time do we have left? We have a minute.
And if anyone is on Twitter, by the way, and would like to follow me, I'm on Vic Strecher at Dung Beetle Press. So Dung Beetle Press is a new not-for-profit press that I created for books and programming in this area.
Oh, that's good to know. I hadn't actually noticed the word Twitter there, and I thought, you have a Dung Beetle Press email address? Okay, here's... Carol wants to know, can you elaborate on ways to pursue purpose when time and money are limited? What do you do when ideal and practical purposes?
Sure. You know, Rachel Raymond, who's a physician and really a philosopher as well, I can't quote her exactly, but she said something to the effect of, in finding a purpose in your life, look at the things around you. It doesn't mean that you have to quit your job and start feeding the poor in Africa, although that might be wonderful and laudable. Maybe right around you is your family, or right around you are people you work with who you could be more attentive to. For me, right around me were my students, and I decided to treat all of my students as if they were my own daughters and work with them very closely. If they needed some time with me, I would give them the time, even if I didn't have it. I would find it, and I'd find the vitality and energy to get that. The person who's a custodian in an elementary school, make sure that the school is clean and safe for his children, as he says it. They're his children. Now you can bet that that person, that custodian, has a very low absenteeism rate, and the students love him and will remember him after they leave that elementary school. So this is not necessarily a top of the pyramid thing where it requires money. It requires thinking. It requires a connection with what your core values are, and then maybe an evening or two of careful thinking where you might even wake up in the middle of the night and go, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to write down for my purpose. You may also repurpose your life over time. There may be multiple purposes you have. Some purposes compete with one another, as we well know. Like our work may compete with our family, with our relationships, with other things. So all of these things have to be negotiated in your mind. But what is important is that you do have this harbor, as Seneca said, for which the winds can blow toward.
Lovely. And as a closing note, Natasha said, just a comment, this was great. I'm a health coach and would love to share this book and app with my clients. This could be such a powerful transformation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And we will talk again soon. Thank you everyone for being here, and have a good weekend. Bye-bye.